Okay, so this session is going to cover the VITA program's intake, interview, and quality review process. It's adapted from IRS publication 5101, which is available online. We're going to move a little bit quickly because this session should serve as a review. Folks here should either be a returner or joined us earlier in the week for our in-person sessions or earlier in the month. But if you want me to slow down, if you have a question, just of course, jump in or drop a note in the chat. So when we talk about intake, we're talking about a part of the tax preparation process. Quality site requirement number 2 for the VITA program states that it is mandatory that Form 13614C is completed for each tax return prepared. And every tax return prepared must include intake, interview, and quality review. Since the VITA program started using Form 13614C, the accuracy of returns has increased. And we do know that as part of volunteer standards of conduct, volunteers who refuse to follow the intake, interview, and quality review process are in violation of the volunteer standards of conduct. All site coordinators, instructors, staff, and volunteers who assist clients with intake, tax prep, and/or quality review must pass the intake, interview, quality review IRS exam every year. So let's talk about what intake and interview means for the VITA program. We know that preparing an accurate tax return begins with explaining the tax preparation process, completing all the questions on Form 13614C, listening to the taxpayer, asking the right questions, and then ends with a quality review. So what parts of that consist of intake and interview? This is the process that needs to be completed before you begin preparing the tax return in TaxSlayer. It has a lot of steps, right? We need to be very thorough in intake and interview before we dive into preparing the return. So we'll walk through each of these steps. When the taxpayer arrives at the site, explain the appointment process to them, right? Let them know they'll be completing paperwork, participating in an interview, providing identity, tax, and other documents. They'll sit for tax preparation, and then they'll move to another volunteer to participate in quality review, and they'll have to sign the return. If you're using a drop-off or virtual preparation process, be sure to explain how that works to the taxpayer and have them sign the virtual consent form. And we want to do this because providing an explanation of the process helps the taxpayer know what to expect, who they're going to interact with throughout their appointment, and how long their appointment might take. We want people to know what they're getting into when they come to our sites. The next step is to verify the taxpayer's identity. So the taxpayer and spouse, if applicable, must show an original non-expired photo ID and a social security card. Social security card, depending on your site's rules, could be an original or a copy or picture, could be a document from the Social Security Administration, such as the SSA 1099, or for folks with an ITIN, it would be their ITIN letter or card. Every dependent listed on the return must also have a social security card meeting these requirements. And the IRS is very clear that a prior year tax return or any other tax form other than the SSA 1099 is not an acceptable form of ID for verifying identity. Only the site coordinator has the discretion to grant an exception to this requirement to provide a valid identification for taxpayers. And this is only for taxpayers who are known to the site, meaning a taxpayer that frequently visits the same site every year for tax return prep and is known to the current site coordinator. Only the site coordinator has the authority to approve these exceptions. So you all who are returning site coordinators know there is a lot of things that can be up to your discretion, but do know that tax sites are like little gossip areas, right? If someone finds out that someone else didn't have to show their social security card, that, people start coming with that expectation. So be sure to use that discretion to your own advantage as well. Next step of the intake is completing the Form 13614C. Typically, the taxpayer completes this form on their own, but some folks will want or need assistance with it. We just talked about in the prior session that the form is revised this year. So we're going to walk through each page. Know that the new intake form is 6 pages long. One is the blank notes page and one is global carry forward, but it is going to look longer and potentially, more overwhelming for some taxpayers. So Here is the first page of the newly revised 13614C. I'm going to point out the changes. There's now a note that folks can put their pronouns optionally if they would like to. It also asks on the kind of mid upper right-hand side, did you work or live in 2 or more states in 2024? It has consolidated checkboxes into one overall section, right? So the ones where you check for you and your spouse, those are more also in one section. And it's moved refund and balance due information, language preference, voter registration information, and the presidential election campaign questions all to page 1. No changes to the marital status section, except for format. But again, the can anyone else claim the taxpayer or spouse on their return is now highlighted in gray, meaning this is to be completed by the volunteer preparer. So the volunteer preparer should use their tax knowledge to determine and ask questions to determine if the taxpayer or spouse could be claimed by someone else. And the volunteer is still required to complete the questions in gray regarding the dependents or potential dependents. Only other thing that's changed in the dependent section is it asks if that dependent was issued an IP PIN. Everything else remains the same. I do want to note, and I'll probably say it several times, it is mandatory to complete the grade for the volunteer to complete the grayed out sections. It's a quality site requirement. That's part of this intake quality site requirement to complete them, and it ensures a more accurate return, and it helps out the quality reviewer and the site coordinator when they're filing. Okay, page 2 is the one that looks really different, right? It's still dedicated to income, but it's broken into 2 halves, and the yes, no, unsure checks boxes are gone. So using the new sheet, clients will need to go through the left half of the form and indicate what types of income they have. The language has been adjusted a bit. It's supposed to be more client friendly. And then the right-hand side, which is now covered over in gray, this is for the volunteer preparer to complete. Again, this is mandatory. The volunteer should be indicating what tax form the client actually has, other info requested, like the number of forms or a specific amount of income, and write down any notes or comments from their interview with the client. When the IRS led their training on this revised sheet, they said it is the volunteer's job to go through and indicate just by hand, like no to anything they do not have, because we don't have that no checkbox anymore. So as always, but especially with this new layout, asking questions during the interview is really, really important. We want to be sure to verify what the client did or did not complete on the left-hand side and use the right-hand side to very clearly indicate what information will go into TaxSlayer. A good practice for that first preparer is to imagine that they are the quality reviewer. What do you need to know to quickly quality review the return? Page 3 follows the same format, but it's asking questions about expenses the client paid and life events that may have impacted the client during the year. There's in the volunteer section, a new spot to indicate what type of deduction the taxpayer will take, what expenses they need to report, and other information like education expenses, sale of home, marketplace insurance, etc. Yes, Kyle said, will we have to review and ask questions all the sections on these kinds of pages? That is what the IRS is saying is the best practice, because there isn't an option for the taxpayer to say no. We want to verify that they didn't miss anything, right? So we want to make sure that they've reported all the types of income they have on here and ask really good clarifying questions. If there are several forms, right? So for the example would be wages up at the top. If there's multiple W-2s, yes, you should total and put that number right here at the top right-hand corner where there's the little number sign. Page 4 has got the demographic questions. The questions are the same as previous years, but the race and ethnicity question is expanded to include examples. These questions are optional for the taxpayer to complete, as always. This year, we at Cash are asking partner sites, and Cash sites to collect this data in TaxSlayer. So if the client does fill it out, then you enter this information in the e-file section under custom questions. And this is going to be in an effort to report more cohesive data back as a coalition to VITA and to the IRS. The VITA grant report specifically asks about the number of clients that check off the different boxes. And so this is going to help us have more cohesive data as a group. But also it may end up shortening your own demographic forms that you all already use. I know several partners do use demographic forms. We are shortening ours a lot right now. I think it is set to be 2 questions in addition to these ones. So think of that as a way to not duplicate questions for clients. Page 5 is totally blank. It's for volunteers to document notes. So use this to your heart's content, put the information that your quality reviewer needs so that it's easy for them to go through and quality review the return. And then as previously was the case, page 6 is global carry forward consent form with no changes from the previous years. So like I said, this is going to be a 6-page form now. I haven't seen them because our materials are not in, but what I've heard is that it will be all connected just like in the past, but I guess it will like flip out like an accordion style. Okay, so while the taxpayer usually completes the form first on their own, right? The preparer's job is to go in and review it, answer clarifying questions, correct anything, and take notes. There's a lot of specific clarifying questions you can use to make sure that everything is complete, right? There's some examples up here on the screen. I'll not read through all of them, but you might ask, I see you marked you have income from wages. How many jobs did you have last year? And now we know we need to indicate that on the form. I see you took an early distribution from a retirement account. Was the money you took out used for a specific purpose, right? We want to document that so that we can ensure they get an exemption if they are allowed to. Folks that, you as a tax preparer know might qualify for certain benefits, like you have a 5-year-old child. Did you pay any childcare expenses while you were at work? The preparer must ensure all questions on page 1 are answered and pages 2 to 3 are complete. The preparer then completes any section marked to be completed by a certified volunteer preparer. These are the sections in gray, and they must be completed for every taxpayer. And then additionally, we've got a expanded notes section throughout the entire document to document information that the taxpayer shares with you that will impact the return. Remember, we're putting ourselves in the shoes of a quality reviewer. What do they need to know? All of this intake process helps us use due diligence, which is something that as a VITA volunteer, we are required to use when completing the intake interview, tax prep, and quality review. So what does that mean? According to the IRS, using due diligence means that as a volunteer, you're required to do your part to ensure the information on the return is correct and complete. So you can rely on information from a taxpayer without requiring documentation or verification for certain things. But it is your role to clarify information that may appear to be inconsistent or incomplete, determine if information is unusual or questionable, and discuss concerns with your site coordinator or your team. If you are not comfortable with the information provided by a taxpayer, you are not obligated to prepare the tax return. So for you all as site managers and coordinators, again, it is typically your call if you're not able to serve a client at your site due to information seeming inconsistent, incomplete, anything like that. All right, so also while we're reviewing Form 13614C, this is our opportunity to determine the certification level needed to complete the return. This looks the same as it did in the past, right? Certification levels are indicated as A, B, or M, advanced, basic, or military, on every item under income, expenses, and life experiences. So for example, the first line under income indicates that wages are a basic level topic. If the return is out of scope for you, for the person preparing, it must be reassigned to a tax preparer with the appropriate certification. And if the return is out of scope for the entire VITA program, it is our role as site coordinators and managers to explain other options that might work for clients. My Free Taxes, Get Your Refund is a way to refer to My Free Taxes, Direct File if they're over the income limit, or referring them to a certified paid preparer. You cannot refer to a specific paid preparer, but you can provide them resources like a list, or you can direct them to the IRS's directory or Maryland's Department of Labor directory. Always check the scope of service chart in the Pub 4012 to verify if anything is out of scope for VITA. If you see something you are not familiar with, you haven't been trained on, check the scope of service chart. All right, next step of intake and interview. So we're not moving on to prepare the return yet, is to determine filing status and dependency. For every return, the preparer should use the information on Form 13614C, information from your interview, so information the taxpayer tells you, and the Pub 4012 to determine who the taxpayer can claim as dependent and the most advantageous allowable filing status. So volunteers should have a copy of the Pub 4012 either on their computer or a physical copy at their workstation and be using this to make their dependency and filing status determinations. And then finally, during intake interview, you must review the taxpayer's documents. Taxpayers, we know, bring their tax forms to provide proof of income. They have forms for different expenses and life events. So this is our opportunity to see what they have and make sure they have everything they need. If a taxpayer is missing a tax form or required documentation, you want to know this early up because you may want to reschedule them for a future date. You may want to know that their return is not going to be filed, but you should determine all the forms they have, what the scope is for that tax topic, and all of that before you start preparing the return. Many sites also use supplemental intake forms. I mentioned Cash's demographic questionnaire. We use that at Cash Run sites and Baltimore area partners. The current draft is available on the resource site, but you can see we're hoping to condense it down quite a bit to just 2 questions. And then we will also at Cash and Baltimore area sites have the tax time financial capabilities referral form, which is updated and revised. We are going to talk about both of these in detail in other trainings, but know that for statewide partners, these are available to you on the resource website as well if you want to use them as templates for making your own forms, or just adapt them to fit your site's needs. All right, so after intake is complete, you will prepare the tax return in TaxSlayer, and then another volunteer will complete a quality review. Quality review, like intake and interview, is an IRS and VITA program requirement. Every client must participate in their quality review to confirm they understand and agree with the information on the tax return. During the quality review, you will review the form 13614C to ensure proper completion and correction of any errors. Sorry. You'll review all supporting documentation and other information provided by the taxpayer to confirm all items were entered correctly on the return. Review your tax law references, that means your 4012, to verify the accuracy of tax law determinations, and inform taxpayers before they sign the return of their responsibility for information on the return. And very importantly, ensure the client's questions are answered. Quality review must be completed by a different volunteer than the one who prepared the return. So some sites use dedicated reviewers. These are volunteers who are solely dedicated to reviewing returns. Others use a peer-to-peer method, meaning a volunteer preparer quality reviews a return done by another preparer, right? If Nate and I are doing a return, we're both ready for quality review at the same time. We can switch off if we both have the appropriate certification levels. Self-review is never acceptable. That would be a violation of the quality standards, QSR's quality site requirements. Remember that the volunteer who does quality review the return must have at least this level of certification required to complete the return. So if there are advanced topics on the return, the quality reviewer needs to also have an advanced certification. The real purpose of quality review is a place to catch mistakes, right? We all make mistakes when entering information into tax returns. So when reviewing a quality return, keep common issues in mind, right? Make sure the social security number and the name matches the social security card. Make sure that if there's an apartment number in their address, that it's in TaxSlayer. Double check dependency for more complicated situations like multi-generational households, cohabitation, custody arrangements, dependency status for our clients who are under 24, right? We really need to determine if they are claimed by their parent or not, or can be claimed. We want to check for incomplete or mistyped forms in TaxSlayer. Make sure everything is put in the correct place. Specifically, 1099 MISC often gets put in the wrong spot. Check our W-2s and 1099-Rs for codes and extra things. Make sure they're both in scope, but also entered correctly. 1099-R code 1, determining if the taxpayer is exempt from that 10% tax. and there's more and more that you all who are returners are very familiar with. Once that quality review is complete, it's time to wrap up the appointment. This involves, of course, printing out a copy of the return for the taxpayer. Sites can set up their own print sets to print a specific selection of forms, or you can use the default ones in TaxSlayer. Next, the person helping them wrap up, typically the quality reviewer, should explain the tax return to the client, walk through their 1040 and state return, have them verify their personal information, right? Make sure that their name is spelled correctly, their social security number and address are correct. Explain where their income is found on the return, their deduction, what credits they're receiving, and how their refund or amount owed is figured. If they do owe, ensure they understand their payment options. We'll have a resource, a one-pager on different ways to pay, available on the resource site before the season starts. And then finally, the client needs to sign the return. So before signing, remind the client that by signing the return, they declare under penalty of perjury that they have examined the return for accuracy and they are responsible for the information on their return. If they are filing jointly with a spouse, both people must be present and sign. And if their e-filing form 8879 should be completed. Gloria asked in the chat, should we build in extra time for appointments due to the intake process? That might be something you want to do. I would probably see how it goes the first few weeks, right? When you have a lighter appointment load, and see how long it's taking. Of course, in the past, you all were doing very thorough interviews as well. This is just a longer form. But yes, if you end up needing more time, of course, that's something you could do.
Yeah, because we usually do we schedule 1 an hour, like if we have 3, how many veteran volunteers? So should we now build in an hour and a half for that, for each person to do that, build that type of schedule in there?
Yeah, that's a good question, Gloria. I think it's going to depend and be different for every site, right? So if that is something you want to try out at the beginning, and it's working well for you, go for it. Also work with Rob to determine what makes most sense for the site, right? But I think it should not take a significantly longer amount of time because it's the same process, but it's just making sure that all the information is documented. But if you do need to extend your appointment times, totally valid thing to do.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions about intake, interview, and quality review? Okay. I'm going to stop our recording for now.